Contemporary historians suggest that a man popularly known as Shaka Zulu was born sometime in the summer of 1787, deep in the heart of the Zulu Kingdom, which occupied what is now the Natal province in the northeastern part of South Africa. At birth, he was named Shaka Kona. His father, Senzanga Kona, was the chief of the Zulu tribe into which Shaka was born. In 1781, a few years before Shaka's birth, Senzanga Kona rose to become the head of the clan. As chief, he had many responsibilities and obligations. Like many Zulu kings, Shaka took numerous wives and fathered many male heirs, which resulted in a number of half-brothers, some of whom would later play significant roles in both his life and the history of the Zulu Kingdom. Shaka and his mother, Nandi, were seen as outcasts because Nandi was not married to Senzanga Kona when Shaka was born. Nandi's father, Bhebhe, was the chief of the Langani clan, a distant branch of the Zulu people. Because of this, Shaka and Nandi were ostracized and eventually exiled during Shaka's childhood. After wandering for some time in the late 18th century, they found refuge with the Mfecane tribe. It was here, as a young warrior, that Shaka thrived, quickly rising to become part of the elite fighting force. In this region, it was customary for all young men to engage in combat once they reached their teenage years. However, Shaka's combat skills were notably advanced for his age. Yet his propensity for extreme violence, even as a young man, was a cause for concern. At a pivotal point in history, King Dingiswayo, the leader of the Mfecane tribe and in many ways Shaka's mentor, sent him and a band of warriors to attack the nearby Amambata people, who were primarily cowherds. Shaka led the assault with ruthless efficiency, ordering his soldiers to kill many of the Amambata before returning to Dingiswayo with their cattle. Dingiswayo reprimanded Shaka for his brutality, explaining that such extreme measures were not the norm for the Mfecane, who believed that people were not meant to be exterminated. Both the Mfecane and the Zulu belonged to larger Bantu-speaking groups, which inhabited nearly all of sub-Saharan Africa, stretching from the Congo Basin to Kenya and southward to the Cape of Good Hope. Before delving further into Shaka's life and the formation of the Zulu Empire, it is essential to examine the factors that contributed to the rise of Zulu society and Bantu civilization at large by the early 19th century. The Zulu people inhabited the northeastern part of what is now South Africa, predominantly between the Tugela River to the south and the Pongola River to the north. The Zulu people and other Bantu groups were united by certain customs, such as their use of cattle and shared Bantu languages. They also practiced agriculture. By the 1700s, the Zulus did not have a unified language, culture, or belief system. They were fragmented into small bands that occupied limited areas of land, sufficient only to rear cattle. Meat and milk were the primary staples of their diet. However, by the late 18th century, the Zulu population and their cattle had grown so much that their lands could no longer support their needs. The Zulu people were still part of the Nguni Kingdom, another Bantu-speaking group located in the northwest, approximately in the region spanning present-day Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Mozambique. The Nduandwe, another powerful group, dominated the Zulu kingdoms around 1800. This territorial expansion led the Zulu to move southwest, pushing out the Khoikhoi, who had previously occupied that area. The chiefs of Zulu clans were called Inkosi, meaning king or paramount chief. These chiefs had multiple wives and many children. Families lived in kraals, also known as isibaya, which were at the lower end of the economic hierarchy. Cattle rearing formed the basis of the Zulu economy, with activities organized within these kraals. Additionally, the Zulu people were rich in culture and arts, with customs and traditions that had flourished for hundreds, even thousands of years, across sub-Saharan Africa. Given that milk was a crucial aspect of the Zulu diet, particularly in the northern province of Zululand, cattle became the most important symbol of wealth. Cattle not only represented wealth, but also served as a medium of exchange. Indeed, cattle were the backbone of Zululand society, although some clans placed more importance on sheep and goats. The males of the Zulu clan would pay portions of cattle, known as lobola, to marry more than one wife, as polygamy was a common cultural practice. The Zulu were also a deeply religious people. Their faith involved a variety of magical practices and the reverence of ancestral spirits. These ancestral spirits were believed to dwell in another world, but became visible during rituals involving fire. Witch doctors, who served as priests, presided over these rites. The Zulu people crafted items such as baskets, spoons, and other tools from wood and soft materials. Simple hearths with small furnaces were used to extract iron, which was abundant in the region. This iron was primarily used to create spearheads and other tools for war. The significance of such weapons to the Zulu people is hard to understand without recognizing that all adult males were warriors. These warriors fought in units called impis, consisting of hundreds of men. Shaka rose to power through his ability to manage cattle and people, a principle he applied to the Zulu Wars and Zulu society. One of the most iconic weapons of the Zulu warriors was the 6-foot-long thrusting spear known as an assegai. In addition to the assegai, the Zulu warriors used cowhide-covered wooden shields for protection. At this time, there were no formalized warfare strategies, and conflicts between clans were generally decided by sheer numbers. When Shaka's father, Senzanga Kona, died in 1816, the Zulu chieftain had already designated his son, Sigujana, as his successor. However, Shaka, who had long been considered an outcast, was determined to destroy any chances of Sigujana assuming power. With the help of Dingiswayo and the Mthethwa clan that had adopted him, Shaka aimed to rule the Zulu in 1816 with a ruthless determination that would come to define his reign for decades. Eventually, Shaka returned to his birth tribe with a large military escort given to him by Dingiswayo. This escort consisted of Mthethwa soldiers who were tasked with executing any men associated with the former regime. Shaka embraced leadership of the Zulu nation and, at the same time, ruled over a large confederation of Bantu tribes in southeastern Africa. This alliance centered on the Zulu people. During this time, Shaka also enlisted the help of his half-brother, Ngwati, to solidify his claim to power. Although Dingiswayo had once reprimanded Shaka for his excessive use of violence, particularly during his attack on the Amambata near Mthethwa territories, this restraint was short-lived. A few months after Shaka took over as the leader of the Zulus in 1817, tensions arose between the Mthethwa and the Nduandwe people along the northern frontiers of Mthethwa land. These tensions led to the capture and execution of Dingiswayo under the orders of Zwaid Langa, the king of the Nduandwe. This event not only caused Shaka to lose his mentor but also marked the beginning of a fierce conflict between the Zulus and the Nduandwe. Following Dingiswayo's death, the Mthethwa surrendered to Shaka, who successfully incorporated their entire clan into the Zulu nation. These events signaled a significant turning point, as Shaka continued to rise in power and influence. By 1817, the growing tensions between the Zulus and Nduandwe erupted into full-scale war. Shaka's forces, consisting of both Zulu and Mthethwa warriors, clashed with Zwaid's Nduandwe army. A major battle occurred in April 1818 near Ulundi, marking the start of the Nduandwe-Zulu War. The war would continue for 2 years, finally ending in 1819, and was a pivotal moment in the growth of the Zulu Kingdom and Shaka's rise as a dominant leader in the region. Despite being at a significant disadvantage, Shaka and his warriors managed to emerge victorious. Zwaid's army, numbering around 12,000 warriors, moved south into Zululand, while Shaka's forces were less than half that size. However, the Zulus managed to prevail, largely due to their advanced warfare tactics and Shaka's strategic brilliance. Since Shaka had already begun to use guerrilla tactics, he placed guerrilla units along the paths of Zwaid's troops, advancing toward Zululand in an effort to stop the Nduandwe from invading. He also scorched the earth, leaving nothing, not even cattle or other livestock, for Zwaid's forces to replenish their supplies as they slowly advanced south. Finally, he positioned most of his forces around Gokokli Hill to compensate for his inferior numbers, taking advantage of the elevation and a stronger defensive posture for the forthcoming battle. The Nduandwe's numerical advantage turned out to be a tactical disadvantage when Nomalanjana, Zwide's commander, and his troops reached Gawkli Hill. The Nduandwe forces became visibly clustered together, making them vulnerable to the missiles launched by Shaka's Zulus, who were perched on the hill above. As the battle progressed, the Nduandwe's situation worsened due to their lack of supply lines, particularly access to fresh water. With his troops floundering, Shaka's anger boiled over several hours into the battle. He then ordered a concealed reserve of his best-trained warriors, who had been hidden nearby, to flank an exposed column of the Nduandwe rearguard. The effect was devastating, as it caused the Nduandwe lines to break catastrophically. The Zulus launched a relentless attack on them in the hours that followed. By the end of the battle, it was claimed, perhaps with some exaggeration, that as many as 7,000 of the Nduandwe host had been killed. This victory reaffirmed Shaka's military prowess and further established his position as a warlord among the larger Bantu populations of sub-Saharan Africa. After his military triumph at the Battle of the Malatuze River in 1819, where he defeated the Nduandwe army, Shaka and his impis moved further into Nduandwe territory, altering the course of the Nduandwe-Zulu War. When they reached King Zwide's residence near Nongoma, it was clear that the outcome of the confrontation would be one-sided. Zwide, along with several key Nduandwe leaders, had already retreated to the northern region. The Nduandwe-Zulu War, fought between 1817 and 1819, saw the expansion of Zulu control over the Nduandwe. Rulers like Zwide chose to shift focus to more northern regions, such as present-day Mozambique and Tanzania. Consequently, Shaka was able to establish a massive Zulu Kingdom, stretching from Natal to the north, approaching what is now modern-day South Africa and Mozambique. How did Shaka Ndaba overcome a numerically superior force and achieve so many military victories in such a short time? The answer lies in the military revolution that Shaka ignited within the Zulu nation, which quickly spread to the entire Bantu civilization in southern Africa. For many years, Zulu warriors had relied on the traditional long thula spear, known as the assegai, a 6-foot-long iron-tipped spear used for hunting and warfare at a distance, but also effective in close combat. In the late 1810s and early 1820s, Shaka introduced military reforms that were crucial to his successes. He began equipping soldiers with a shorter sword-like weapon for close combat, as the longer spears were no longer advantageous in the battlefield. This new weapon was used by Shaka during the Battle of Gawkli Hill, where he himself suffered many combat wounds while fighting with a spear. Shaka is also credited with creating the bullhorn tactic formation, a strategy he may have developed while allied with the Mthethwa under Dingiswayo. In an ideal situation, the horns would completely surround the opposition, and the Zulu impis would be in the middle of a bloodbath, as the enemies under the bullhorn were isolated. The formation of the bullhorn also advanced towards the enemy, with the foremost section of the center, known as the chest, engaging the enemy. The warriors situated at the ends of the formation, known as the wings or horns, were usually the swift and youthful fighters. Shaka also maintained rigorous military order and ensured a system where all Zulu boys were inducted into his armies upon reaching puberty. He restructured the Zulu army based on chronological age and fighting capabilities, with the most battle-hardened fighters forming the core of the hollow square in the middle, and the younger, fast-moving soldiers placed on the wings of the advance. In spite of these military traits, some elements of the Shakan military revolution are exaggerated. One such myth is the popular belief that Shaka made his warriors engage in combat mostly barefoot to toughen their feet. However, there is no solid evidence to support this claim. Nevertheless, several anthropologists have noted that Shaka's armies were subjected to rigorous training, which involved marching troops for an entire day after building up their stamina by covering long distances. Shaka did not force his soldiers into strict military formations, without first ensuring the army held high regard within Zulu society. His military reforms could only be implemented alongside improvements in the structure and mentality of Zulu culture, which created enabling conditions for the army. The classic system that favored individuals for high posts in the army and civic administration regardless of age, was abolished by Shaka when he reshaped the Zulu way of life. Furthermore, he challenged the powerful group of medicine practitioners and assumed authority over the Zulu religious institution. He reorganized the child-driven societal order, training Zulu children to fetch supplies for the armies. With the help of close friends, Shaka provided a level of governance within the army, improving its mobility. Very soon after Shaka was crowned king, the Zulus, Mthethwa, and Nduandwe were all united under one ruler, Shaka. So far, most attention has focused on the rise of Shaka in sub-Saharan Africa. However, after consolidating the position of the Zulu nation in the late 1810s, Shaka and the Zulu began encountering new and even more threatening peoples, including the Europeans who had recently settled in southern Africa during the 1820s. To the southwest of them, at the Cape of Good Hope and increasingly to the north and northeast, they came into contact with these Europeans. Europeans, engaged in their maritime expeditions, navigated around the African continent in search of a sea route to Asia, reaching the southern tip of Africa in the 15th century. This marked the dawn of the colonial era in the region. In the 16th century, following the lead of their settlements in Asia and the Americas, the Portuguese began constructing small outposts along the African coastline to create supply and trading ports. The first major European settlement in southern Africa was established in 1652 by the Dutch East India Company. Like the earlier Portuguese, this was initially a stopping point for vessels on the Africa-Asia voyage, but in the years to come, this place, known as the Cape Colony, developed into a significant territory in its own right. More and more settlers arrived, including German Protestant refugees. Eventually, these settlers became targets of assaults by the Dutch Republic towards the close of the 16th and early 17th centuries. The colonists included Dutch settlers and French Huguenots. By the late 18th century, the population of the Cape Colony had exceeded 50,000 people, who were referred to as Boers, a term meaning farmers in Afrikaans and Dutch. However, due to events in Europe, the geopolitics of the region was on the verge of a significant transformation. The French Revolutionary Wars began between Britain and the Dutch Republic in the 1790s, resulting in the British occupation of the Cape Colony. After a swift defeat of the foe during the Battle of Muizenberg, which took place at the beginning of autumn, the British forces took control of the Cape Colony. Almost 20 years later, towards the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1814 was signed by the British and Dutch sovereigns with respect to the colony of the Cape, thus incorporating it within the boundaries of the British Empire. At the time when the Zulu king Shaka found himself, the British had already become the foremost occupying power at the Cape of Good Hope, or so they thought. Yet to the Zulus, the affairs of the Cape Colony were far off, as the impact of the British conquest was more direct for others. Most of the Boer population, consisting predominantly of Dutch settlers, were forced to lose dominance over the Cape Colony. As a result, they began to disperse from the colony's southern boundaries northwards and northeastwards, allowing them to distance themselves from the British Empire and establish new colonies of their own. This expansion would bring the Boers even closer to the Zulu Kingdom in the 19th century, which would affect both Shaka and his successors. The encroachment of Europeans into these territories began slowly in 1822, when Francis Farewell, a former lieutenant of the British Royal Navy, and other merchants of Cape Colony, decided to trade with the Zulus and natives of an area that would soon be known as Durban, the future town in the Natal region. The port city of Durban is situated on Natal's coast. The port located here, as well as the Europeans who came to Natal because of the occupation, are of great importance to Zulu history and hence to the history of Shaka. In 1824, this development was transformed by the Zulus and the ever-increasing white population of southern Africa into a trading station, marking the first physical trade and communication boundaries. The accounts of several modern-day Europeans who met Shaka and lived in southern Africa at the time provide us with insights into both Shaka and the rise of the Zulu Kingdom. One such individual was Nathaniel Isaacs, an English traveler and trader who arrived at the Cape Colony in 1825 and ventured northeast shortly thereafter. The intention of this later venture was to trade with the Zulus in Natal and look for Henry Francis Finn, an Englishman with some medical training who had been lost to the region sometime earlier. What they found was breathtaking. Finn had been living within Zulu society and had recently healed Shaka with the application of some European medicine. Besides marrying 4 Zulu women, which was common in a polygamous society, Finn was given land in Zululand and acculturated to Zulu ways. Years of Zulu contact culminated in the publication of Travels and Adventures in Eastern Africa, a 2-volume work by Isaacs and Finn in 1836. This became the major source of information about Shaka and his empire. It contains the first European record of King Shaka and his Zulu nation. Despite these initial contacts between the Zulu nation and European settlers who arrived in Natal during the 1820s, Shaka's greatest conflicts were with other Bantu peoples. During these years, he launched offensives against neighboring countries, incorporating their territories into the expanding Zulu Kingdom. This included endless campaigns against these peoples, employing the military techniques he had innovated at the outset of his rule. However, Shaka also displayed political finesse, as he was adept at managing warfare and diplomacy. He possessed a unique skill for diplomacy and managed to incorporate numerous tribes into the growing Zulu Empire in the 1820s without the use of garrisons or overwhelming imperial force. A network of intertribal alliances and treaties allowed him to integrate tribes peacefully. For instance, King Matubeni of the Thuli tribe, King Jobi of the Scythole, and King Zihilando of the Mkizi tribes became part of the Zulu Kingdom without conflict or war, instead joining as subordinate or tributary states. War was, and remained, one of the predominant themes that characterized the reign of Shaka. The Zulu Kingdom was established at a considerable human price. It is notoriously complicated to assess the number of people who were killed during the period of 1816 to 1828, when Shaka was at the helm and waging a series of wars in Zulu history, mainly because such records as death certificates, census data, army lists, and other records to indicate the level of death toll in southeastern Africa during his reign do not exist. However, an attempt will be made to calculate the total amount of people who died during the reign of Shaka. 19th century Africanists who study sub-Saharan Africa often refer to this period as derived from a Zulu word, Mfecane, which refers to the crushing or scattering due to the extreme and brutal upheaval and overwhelming mortality that affected regions of South Africa, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Rwanda. It is notable for instances such as the war with the Nduandwe, which occurred between 1817 and 1819, and is estimated to have led to deaths exceeding 25,000, a figure accounted for in the last 50 years. It has also been estimated that between 1 million to 2 million deaths occurred during the Mfecane era, especially due to Shaka's wars. Therefore, we could say with fair certainty that at the very least, 100,000 people lost their lives during the wars and the shaping of the Zulu Kingdom under Shaka's leadership. The figure is more likely than not much higher. That much is quite clear. Shaka had a tendency towards violence. After the conquest of a certain territory by his armies, they would attack the communities dwelling in that region and burn several kraals and other structures, killing indiscriminately, if one is to trust the accounts of those who describe such events. Children, old men, and women were left alive, while only able-bodied men were drafted to fight in the Zulu army. Shaka demonstrated clear trends of a genocidal ruler regarding his territories, with many changes stemming from depraved acts of violence and bloodshed by his soldiers during conquest. However, this only worsened the situation in the region, as some of Shaka's fiercest generals opted to abandon their lord and create and rule new kingdoms. For instance, Mzilikazi exited the Zulus' original territory in the middle of the 1820s and carried a considerable number of cattle and warriors with him to create his own Ndebele state. Likewise, Zwangendaba, one of Shaka's generals, also went north to present-day Zimbabwe and set up his own empire in that area. Shaka, through military reforms that he embarked on, helped in the development of a large Zulu Kingdom, with later battles occurring towards the late 1810s and early 1820s. By 1825, he had expanded his territory to cover more than 30,000 kilometers northwards from the Pongolo River down to central Natal and from the ocean towards the Drakensberg Mountains. In this region, he must have managed to incorporate close to 250,000 Zulus in addition to many other peoples, creating a complex administrative structure that facilitated the distribution of tributes in the form of food, cattle, ivory, textiles, and other goods. Shaka's rule can be traced back to the 1820s with accounts from Isaacs, Finn, and other historians, though some aspects of his life remain obscured. Of the many things that are difficult to understand about him, dynamics of his family life probably top the list. One might reason, considering the polygamous nature of Zulu society, that a male warrior king like Shaka Zulu would have had several wives, dozens of women kept primarily for sexual purposes, and quite a number of children sired by those women. The goal would have been to produce many sons, with the hope of one being the bravest warrior who could rule the kingdom. To circumvent any possibility of a succession crisis caused by a large harem of children, Shaka made it a point not to announce any of his children to the public. Based on different assumptions, Shaka was said to be probably impotent or perhaps bisexual, but that is subject to challenges. By doing this, Shaka ensured that candidates for the throne would compete based on merit, not simply because of birth order, as practiced by the nobility in Europe. Given that Shaka was still in his 30s, with no signs of declining health in the 1820s, it is quite possible that he did not want to reveal the names of his children to avoid prospects of competition or factions forming within clans. If this was the case, it means that Shaka's descendants were not many, as he died quite early. The disappointments that began to afflict the Zulu Kingdom in the mid-1820s would require perhaps a little more explanation, but much attention should be focused on the fact that Shaka's conquests and the beginning of his reign were remarkable in the political arena due to the almost astronomical success he seemed to attain. He was able not only to return to his land and, improbably enough, become the head of the Zulus in 1816, before several of his half-brothers, who were actively contending for that role, but also to achieve this within a short period. With assistance from the Mthethwa, Shaka was able to develop a revolution in the military, which played a key role in helping defeat a good number of tribes and create the greatest empire that the region of southeastern Africa had witnessed in a long time. The effectiveness of this system, however, led to its replication within a short period, and consequently, by the 1820s, there was opposition to the Zulus. Of various tribes, the oldest group among the competition was led by a skilled military leader under Shaka, Madlaka Kansidi. Shaka constructed a Zulu royal capital here called Bulawayo, which translates to place of death. This was a comparatively larger town than most growing Zulu settlements, all of which were practically colonies. This strategic center, established by Shaka, south of the Mlathuze River, was situated on a chain of hills approximately 27 kilometers north of present-day Ishiwe. This site could very well symbolize Shaka's entire rule. Centered in Bulawayo, Shaka and his sultana and concubines resided in the Iso Godlo, or royal enclosure. This was a well-guarded place, and it was death to be found there without royal orders from Shaka. The Iso Godlo was also the seat of governance, as well as a Zulu harem. In fact, some of the ministers in Shaka's government and his most trusted aides occupied bungalows next to the Iso Godlo. However, the era's political and military establishments were very backward, and technology was lacking. The same court system that had existed in Europe during the Viking Age was also in place by 1826 and 1827. An usher at the Iso Godlo, who would wake up early to call the residents of Bulawayo and announce the rise of the Zulu king, was a harbinger of thunderstorms. The ceremonies required by the Zulu king were highly structured, with specific routines for each hour of the day and for particular occasions. Such evening meals were accompanied by various seating and eating orders. Visitors were received warmly, with official courtesy and light beverages. British officials who zigzagged toward the Zulu court in the latter part of the 1820s and the following decades would have experienced this structured society and camaraderie. They found a great part of the taboos and rituals at the Zulu court, particularly at the king's courts, strange. This was the profile of the Zulu court at the center of Shaka's empire, which had been created a decade after his first successful insurrection in 1880-1816. However, this late into his reign, as Shaka became more tyrannical, it would have been increasingly oppressive to even exist within such conditions. Shaka was undoubtedly a tyrant. For instance, the Zulu warlord is notoriously remembered for one story where he enclosed enemies and fed them to external hyenas and jackals, waiting until the animals had their fun and exterminated the target of Shaka's anger. In the 12th month of 1827, when Nandi, Shaka's mother, passed away, Shaka's temperament became ever more irrational, especially concerning the events around him. It was a message to all potential resistors of the Zulu king's might when Shaka would incinerate the hut or kraal where the so-called hostile party had taken shelter. Even as a child, although he was not yet known by anyone, it is likely that the older Shaka's tortured and insightful mind had started predicting the sibilant closeness of hatred toward enlightenment through the ecstatic love of his ideological parents. For Shaka, no personal tragedy was greater than the death of his mother and the fathomless grief that followed. He nearly went berserk in the days and weeks after her death. The monarch ordered his subjects to stay in mourning for an extended period, and some were even punished for not demonstrating enough sorrow, some to the point of death. Historians later noted that the real issue was Shaka's order to halt essential activities, such as planting and milking, as people had turned into mourners. As months passed, this led to the emergence of a mild famine in Zululand. It is possible that some of the later accounts about Shaka's erratic behavior in the final months of his life were invented to discredit his reign by those who conspired against him after Nandi's death. Two of Shaka's half-brothers, Dingjane and Malanjana, were the proponents of this plot, and it was traced back to Shaka's own family. Shaka's brothers had attempted to assassinate him in the autumn of 1828, but the attempt had failed, and they had returned to anonymity after their treachery. Now, they had additional allies, specifically Mkabayi, the aunt of Shaka and sister of the deceased king Sinzangakona. Together with a few other co-conspirators, they arrived at Kwanyakamubi, one of Shaka's residences, on the afternoon of September 22, 1828. Shaka was displeased by their arrival and sent them away, asserting that it was already too late for visitors. Nevertheless, each of them, several of whom tried to assault him, was joined by Dingjane and Malangana, leaping over the kraal fence, and the Zulu king was soon overpowered. The Zulu king is said to have looked back at them and addressed, "My father's children, what is going on? Is it wrong?" There are other accounts that state he prophetically asked these Earth's monarchs a similar question: "Why do you stab me?" But no matter the facts, all of us know what happened next. The 41-year-old king of the Zulus, who had reunited the warring clans and nurtured the kingdom for over 10 years, was pronounced dead right then and there. After the assassination of Shaka, the killer of Shaka and his half-brother, Dingjane, ascended to the throne of the Zulu Empire. Marked by paranoia, his rule led him to continue the extensive purge of most of the surviving members of the broader royal clan just a few weeks and months later, in order to consolidate his gains and remove any threats to his rule. Nevertheless, the most formidable challenge to Shaka's authority was not from within the Zulu Kingdom. Rather, to prevent being colonized by the British, those Boer societies situated further southwest began heading northeast, deeper into the land, in the 1880s year, 1836. Piet Retief was the first of these Voortrekkers, also known as Boer trekkers, to associate with Dinggane's Zulus and follow them into the interior. However, after a rift, and under the leadership of Andries Pretorius, who became prominent among them, the Zulus started contending with an ever-encroaching threat from the Voortrekkers. Once Pretorius triumphed against Dingjane in warfare waged in 1839, the Zulu chief retreated to Swaziland, where he reunited with his half-brother Mpande, who had escaped the earlier purges aimed at Dingaane, and allied himself with Pretorius. In the year 1840, during a period of civil strife following Dingaane's death, Pretorius went on to coronate Mpande as the king of the Zulus. At this time, Pretorius, together with his fellow Voortrekkers, also created the country of Natalia. Nevertheless, each of them, several of whom tried to assault him, was joined by Dingaane and Mahlangana, leaping over the kraal fence, and the Zulu king was soon overpowered. The Zulu king is said to have looked back at them and addressed, "My father's children, what is going on? Is it wrong?" There are other accounts that state he prophetically asked these Earth's monarchs a similar question: "Why do you stab me?" But no matter the facts, all of us know what happened next. The 41-year-old king of the Zulus, who had reunited the warring clans and nurtured the kingdom for over 10 years, was pronounced dead right then and there. After the assassination of Shaka, the killer of Shaka and his half-brother, Dingaan, ascended to the throne of the Zulu Empire. Marked by paranoia, his rule led him to continue the extensive purge of most of the surviving members of the broader royal clan just a few weeks and months later, in order to consolidate his gains and remove any threats to his rule. Nevertheless, the most formidable challenge to Shaka's authority was not from within the Zulu Kingdom. Rather, to prevent being colonized by the British, those Boer societies situated further southwest began heading northeast, deeper into the land. In the 1880s year, 1836. Piet Retief was the first of these Voortrekkers, also known as Boer trekkers, to associate with Dingaane's Zulus and follow them into the interior. However, after a rift and under the leadership of Andries Pretorius, who became prominent among them, the Zulus started contending with an ever-encroaching threat from the Voortrekkers. Once Pretorius triumphed against Dingaane in warfare waged in 1839, the Zulu chief retreated to Swaziland, where he reunited with his half-brother Mpande, who had escaped the earlier purges aimed at Dingaane, and allied himself with Pretorius. In the year 1840, during a period of civil strife following Dingaane's death, Pretorius went on to coronate Mpande as the king of the Zulus. At this time, Pretorius, together with his fellow Voortrekkers, also created the country of Natalia. The Anglo-Zulu War lasted only 6 months, from January to June 1879. It is largely due to the 1964 biopic Zulu, starring Mfecane, and its later prequel Zulu Dawn, featuring Burt Lancaster and Peter O'Toole, that these conflicts have reached a Western audience. However, these films have also created an impression that the Zulu army emerged victorious in the war, with the first film's plot based on a helpless British garrison under siege by hordes of Zulu warriors. However, the overall picture was quite different when it came to the actual fighting, which took a matter of 6 months in 1879, bringing a complete defeat to British troops and nearly annihilating the Zulu nation. Zulu Dawn, a film based on the battle, details the infamous Isandlwana episode, which was one of the largest defeats suffered by a British colonial army in the 19th century. In 1878, Sir Bartle Frere, the High Commissioner of the British Empire in the Cape Colony, manipulated King Cetshwayo to provoke a war against the Zulus. Frere at first triggered a boundary entanglement with the Zulus, and come December, forwarded an ultimatum to King Cetshwayo, which was unreasonable in its requirements. For example, it demanded that the Zulus disband their entire army, including Christian missionaries. The worst of all, however, was that a British resident would be assigned to the Zulu King's court under the pretext of representing Her Majesty the Queen. The ultimatum specified that this resident was not to be an ordinary ambassador, and in fact, required his appearance in court sessions with Cetshwayo prior to the resident being given his position. It was also stated that he would enjoy diplomatic immunity and be allowed to carry out his misadventures in the Zululand Empire. History repeated itself on December 11, 1878, when Lord Chelmsford and a large contingent of British troops crossed the Zulu borders. The stratagem first proposed deploying 16,000 troops in 5 brigades. However, less than 10,000 men were mobilized and reorganized into 3 divisions. On the other hand, Cetshwayo had an army of approximately 35,000, most of them combatants equipped with primitive weapons, spears, shields, and a few guns. Even though they were technologically inferior, the Zulus successfully fended off the first waves of invasion into Zululand and struck first. In present-day South Africa's northeast region, on January 22nd, around 40,000 Zulu warriors ambushed a lone column of 1,800 British and colonial troops stationed on the hill of Isandlwana. The British completely underestimated the Zulus and did not bother to fortify their position at Isandlwana. But even British cutting-edge military technology could not compensate for the Zulus' overwhelming numbers. The Zulu bullhorn formation encircled the British troops. The British forces also ran out of ammunition during the last stages of the fighting, resulting in a vicious close combat battle where the Zulus had the upper hand. Of the 1,800 British and colonial forces present during the Battle of Isandlwana, only a small fraction managed to escape with their lives, while roughly 1,300 were left dead on the battlefield. Although exact figures cannot be provided for Zulu casualties, estimates suggest that many Zulus were also killed or wounded. The next day at Rorke's Drift, a nearby mission station, 150 British soldiers managed to withstand a Zulu attack of nearly 3,500 warriors, an event that somewhat mitigated the devastating defeat suffered by British arms at Isandlwana. Zulu Dawn and Zulu focused primarily on the battles of Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift, respectively. Towards the beginning of the summer campaign in 1879, Lord Chelmsford, aware of the impending recall of his command, decided to lead an expedition into Zululand, hoping to salvage what remained after the disaster at Isandlwana. This second effort was more successful than the first invasion because it came in the wake of the defeat at Isandlwana, though some detachments continued to cross into and around the border with Zululand through the spring. Conquering was easier this time, partly because Chelmsford had over 20,000 soldiers accompanying him, significantly larger compared to the previous campaigns where he was overwhelmed. The July 4, 1879, Battle of Ulundi placed 4,000 British and colonial troops against 13,000 Zulus, the majority of whom were soldiers under the command of King Cetshwayo. The British gunners, equipped with Gatling guns, proved decisive in defeating the Zulu warriors' strategies, leading to a British victory. Consequently, the Zulu fighters retreated from the high ground, leaving only 10 British casualties. On the battlefield of Ulundi, over 500 Zulus had died, with another 1,000 suffering from moderate wounds. The outside world learned, however, that the military victory at Ulundi quashed all hopes for any British colonial resistance during the Anglo-Zulu War, and also marked the end of Zulu independence as a nation, which had been established by Shaka more than 50 years before. After the war, Cetshwayo was very much a token king, and Queen Victoria, flying him to England for an audience with her, was a mere formality. In 1884, he would die, despite the efforts of his son Dinu Zulu in the preservation of the Zulu monarchy. In 1887, the British acquired Zululand via their association with Boer republics. It was the beginning of a period characterized by vigorous British colonization and consolidation of power in South Africa, which would provoke two military confrontations with the Boers in the years 1880 to 1881, and more importantly, in 1899 to 1902. As it became clear later in the second conflict, referred to as the Second Anglo-Boer War, the British had established control over an approximate area of modern-day South Africa. Thus, the Zulu Empire, as established by Shaka between the years 1816 to 1828, lasted for 50 years without succumbing to the Anglo-Zulu incursions. Even though there was the presence of the British Empire, the Zulu Kingdom, together with the other Boer republics, was unable to hold back British colonialism in southern Africa. Given everything Shaka fought so hard to build, and the legacy of the Zulu Kingdom after his death, what should one think about Shaka Zulu? Some picture Shaka as a heroic figure who wanted to unite various tribes into a single Zulu nation that would not be intimidated by the white men advancing toward Africa, but that is the least thing one could give him. Shaka lived in a time much easier to survive in Africa than later on, as it is famous to quite a number of people how, in the 19th century, African countries were subjected to European imperialism. Rather, this trend was just starting during the period coinciding with Shaka's ascent to the throne. The rule of Shaka in Africa south of the Sahara was characterized by the absence of European powers, except in a few coastal areas that included the Cape Colony, the Gold Coast, and some others along the western coastline. Therefore, the real scramble for Africa only started in the 1860s and 1870s, while the Zulus and other African ethnic groups were still securing their territories. Shaka could not have perceived the British and the Boers, who were increasingly becoming problematic to their lifestyles during the 1810s and 1820s, as an immediate danger since they would have known illness existed in Europe and gradually interacted with them as merchants. Consider this. It is very possible that we view Shaka not as a warrior fighting colonialism, but as a hungry individual who carved out the Zulu Empire for his self-interests. Shaka's life, woven into the fabric of his people, surfaced this obsession with fighting relatives, other tribes of the Bantu nation, leaving no mercy. This straightforward reality entails that Shaka committed brutal atrocities, amounting to the massacre of tens and probably hundreds of thousands of people in pursuit of political power. His strategy as a military general, bringing the Zulu nation together as one unit for an effective fighting force, and the warfare of that period were impressive in those days. After reaching such heights, he never fought openly, and when it was required, it was only in extreme cases, behavior reminiscent of many Caesars or Asian emperors. Emperor Shaka may have been the man who created the Zulu Kingdom, but there is no doubt that by the 19th century, this kingdom dealt one of the largest military defeats to British regiments in Africa. This, more than anything, has engraved the Zulu Kingdom established by Shaka in southern Africa into people's memories. So, what's your take on Shaka Zulu? Would you consider him a great African warrior king who built a kingdom that was able to repel European invasions even decades after his demise, or a bloody chieftain who rose to power by oppressing his countrymen? Thank you so much for watching, and please tell us your thoughts in the comments section.